Wait for 1 second.
Oh, right. You introduce me and then I'll start talking.
Yeah, just wait. Hello, everyone. Well, we are talking today about a completely new subject we have never talked about, CBT. Well, we're going to find that out from Carrie, who is joining me live from UK. She is a CBT accredited therapist. Thank you so much, Carrie.
Thank you, Amita. Thank you for having me here. Yes, so as Amita has said, I'm a cognitive behavioural therapist, and that's a type of therapy that works on understanding our problems in our current situations predominantly. So it's looking at how we can manage our situations at the moment and learn to step back and think about them differently. So this presentation is very broad. It's an overview really to get an understanding of what CBT is, and then you can maybe apply or think about how that might support you or help you in something that you're experiencing. It's very helpful for all sorts of conditions, from sort of physical health, pain, for people with menopause conditions where they're struggling with the sensations and coming to terms with changes. It's also useful for depression, for trauma-based difficulties that people are experiencing. So it's got a very wide remit and so helpful. I've used CBT for many years now, and it is so good. So I'm really happy to be sharing this with you today. So a little bit just about me. So I'm a therapist from the UK. I was an occupational therapist working with mental health and physical health conditions, and then trained in 2008 in cognitive behavioural therapy, because I really wanted to get underneath the surface of how do we come to terms with changes, how do we deal with difficulties that we're experiencing that might come out in illness in some way physically, but psychologically we struggle sometimes to understand what's going on and how we feel inside. So I wanted to really make that connection, and CBT really has helped me to do that and share that with other people. I'm also trained in interpersonal therapy and EMDR, which you might not know, but it's a trauma-based discipline to help with people, particularly if they have multiple traumas in their life. So don't just take it from me, but I've been working with hundreds of people, both in groups and also individually, in all sorts of walks of life. So it doesn't matter what life experiences you have, CBT can be very helpful for that. So these are some of the things people have said, which is quite helpful. So I just wanted to go through. So with the therapy style that I use, we set out a structure, and an agenda is often at the start of any sort of work that we do together, because it helps us to contain what's going on, but also to sort of focus and set ourselves sort of goals or outcomes that we want to achieve from the time we spend together. So setting an agenda helps us keep on track, and also shares responsibility as well. So it's not just, you know, somebody turning up and talking to me and offloading. It's really about, okay, so what are we going to do about this? It's a very action-based sort of therapy. So that's why I've put it down as an agenda here, so you can sort of see that's how I work generally. So we're going to just look at some of the signs when you're not doing so well. So understanding it from a cognitive behavioural therapy sort of viewpoint. And then I'm going to really sort of help you work through, well, what is it that we do when we're in CBT? And then how we might work through a difficulty with that CBT lens. Helping to sort of see how we can challenge our mindset and habits. And then I'll leave you with some tips to help increase well-being. Now, of course, this is just an overview. So if you do have any questions, if anyone has any questions, you can always put something forward and Amita can pass them on to me now, you know, if they're in the chat in Facebook, or if they're on this Zoom, if anyone's on Zoom. If there are any questions, if we have time, I'm very happy to answer anything. If you've got any questions around this, I do like to guide people and help people as much as I can with these sorts of programs, because it is me talking at you for the half hour. So if you have got a burning question, please feel free to write it down. Okay, so let's go into sort of understanding the problems that you might be experiencing. So when you are noticing yourself feeling not as well as you would like, we sort of take note often of our maybe physical sensations. So we sort of recognize that we're feeling more lethargic, or we're not able to concentrate so much. And we might notice that our appetite has changed, or that we're not sleeping so well, we're waking up more in the night. These are all signs that maybe our balance isn't there in our bodies, that something is not in kilter as much as we would like. So it's really helpful as a first stage to sort of recognize for you what your stress signs are. What are the things you would be able to sort of say, well, when I start to get stressed, I get headaches. I was talking to somebody yesterday and they get strong headaches, and she said, well, I came into therapy because I was getting these migraines, which is a real notch it up. So it's trying to understand before it gets really bad, what are the sorts of things you might experience physically that you can recognize that might tell you things are not going so well. But aside of that is also to emotionally try and be in touch. So the physical sensations are that sort of representation of how you might be feeling, but emotionally it's trying to recognize and label those feelings that you might be feeling, like frustration or irritability. You might start to recognize, oh, I'm really on edge a lot more. I'm really snappy with my partner, and I'm really starting to see that that's part of the picture. So we see those things, so those sort of changes in behavior, but also changes in our emotional state. And significantly in cognitive behavioral therapy, so the cognitions, those thoughts, is what we're quite interested in, because we have a dialogue running in our head all the time. And if we can start to pay attention to what we're saying in our heads, that gives us a good clue as to whether we are being reasonable with ourselves, or whether we're being more critical or fearful, and maybe being catastrophic, so that thinking the worst when we are talking to ourselves. So just looking at this is starting to orientate yourself to stepping back, not just being, I'm so angry, but okay, I'm noticing I'm feeling angry, and I'm noticing that I'm more tense in my body, and I'm noticing I keep being cross in my head and telling myself off, berating myself. So once we start to step back a little bit, we have a little inroad, we have a way maybe of doing something differently. Once we catch and capture that there's something going on, there's something that I'm not happy with, there's something that feels off balance. So that's the starting point. And when we start to write things down, we can notice more clearly if there are patterns occurring. And again, this style of therapy is really helpful for trying to see, how am I talking to myself in the same way at the same time? And am I reacting to things in an automatic way that seems to be affecting me and maybe increasing the likelihood of me feeling more stressed and more frustrated and continuing a cycle? So if you're noticing yourself feeling stressed and anxious, you can maybe notice that you feel more pain in the body, and that affects maybe how you're eating, it affects your concentration, and it maybe affects your sleep. Often we know if we're in more pain, we're not going to sleep so well. If we're struggling with stress, we may be worrying about things in the night, and that affects our sleep. And of course, then if our sleep's getting affected, our energy is reduced, and then we may not feel like we want to do the things that we normally do. We might not be exercising so much. We will not be bothered to cook. So therefore we're eating just on the go and things that maybe are not so healthy for us. And that affects our brain function. So if our brain function is affected, it's likely we'll feel more stressed. If we're not doing the exercise or seeing people or doing the things we would normally do that keep us well, we're going to feel maybe worse in our mood, feel bad in ourselves. And so you can see these vicious cycles can start up. And we don't know where sometimes they come from. That it's like accumulation. So a few days of not sleeping well leads to changes, leads to more stress and low mood. And then we're in to a cycle where it's hard to really pinpoint what's going on, but it's going on. So I thought I'd just share this. It's very brief, but it's just to help you understand that, you know, we can have certain thoughts and they can be negative, but we can move through them and they don't affect us so much. But if we start to notice there's a pattern that we keep going back to this way of thinking, we may be getting into a groove, a habit where we need to step back more clearly and start to make maybe some changes. So this is the principle that we're looking at, the principles of CBT. So the principle says that we have lots of feelings, we have lots of physical sensations going on in our bodies all the time. And we can't change how we feel directly just by wanting to feel different. You know, I want to feel happy. We can't just make ourselves feel happy. I want to feel well. I want to feel differently. I want this to go away. We can't change things just by wanting the feelings to go. The feelings are there because there are some thoughts around that maybe are linked with those feelings that we're experiencing. So when we are in a certain physical or emotional state, the helpful approach is what we notice in CBT is that we have to understand what is linking us to these feelings right now. So in the moment, in that situation, what am I saying to myself? What's running through my head? What does that mean about me? Or what does that say about the other person? So we start off just understanding and getting a good understanding of situations that are happening that you're unhappy about, you're not feeling good about, you've stopped doing the things you enjoy, and starting to look at, well, what is it that's going on? What are you saying? And what does that mean? And once we've got a good idea of that, it can help us to sort of see, where is that coming from? Is this coming from experiences from the past? Or is this coming from an anxiety state of fear of the future? So sometimes it's more of the future based fear and it's more anxiety based. And sometimes it might be more ruminating, going over things that we can't change, that leave us feeling worse or negative in ourselves, feeling unhappy in ourselves. So we change directly the thinking. We help people to look at the way you're talking to yourself, the way you're having a conversation in your head, maybe being critical, and how we can step back and say, well, it doesn't mean it's true just because you're saying it. It's not a fact right now. It's just your opinion. It's just the way you are giving yourself this information. And it can be filtered through a lens, really, of your experiences that you're holding or how you've been brought up. All of those sort of experiences can lead you to have certain ways of thinking about things, but they're not fixed. And that's the key, that we can change the way we talk to ourselves and we can change the way we look at situations. But that's not all. That's only half of the story, because without changing our behaviors and without doing things differently, we quite often go back to the old habit of thinking. So we have to push ourselves to try something in a different way. So if we have a negative way of, oh, I never get things right, I'm not going to try that new salsa class because I'm rubbish, I'm terrible on my feet. We can have a different perspective saying, well, you don't know till you try. You know, you've tried other things and over time you've got better. If you enjoy it, why not? You can have that different perspective. But if you don't go to the class and try it out, you're never going to know. It's never going to sit with you. It's never going to become something that you believe because you haven't tried it out. You haven't pushed yourself out of your comfort zone and tried that alternative perspective. So that's what cognitive behavioral therapy is. So it's looking at the thinking, but also directly linking with, you have to do something differently. Without doing it differently, things invariably won't change significantly. You might have a light bulb moment, but you're not going to really believe it or be able to sort of wholeheartedly, authentically feel differently if you're not doing it in a different way. So I hope that makes sense. But that's the premise really of CBT. So it's simple. It's quite straightforward. It's not something complicated, but the difficulty comes when we're having to change our old habits. It feels so much easier just to go on as we were, even though we're not really happy in what we're doing. It's somehow harder to push ourselves and try something new because we don't know how it's going to turn out. But that's why sometimes people do have therapy sessions or go through sort of self-help or have something alongside to help them through that process. There's good apps out there. There's lots of self-help books for CBT that are very useful. There's lots of free information online as well that I often hand out to people because it's so useful and so straightforward. But the key comes to being consistent and not being hard on yourself and just trying things out. And just being aware of the time. I know I talk a lot, so Amita, just stop me if I go get too long-winded. But anyway, I thought it would be useful to give an example because that can sometimes help us to sort of think about things differently. So again, here's the thought, feelings, physical sensations and actions and behaviors. So you can just write these down on a piece of paper. And if you're, say, in a work situation and you've been given a report or something that you've never done before, you might be really worried about it. You might be worried about making mistakes. People often find themselves overthinking, getting anxious, worried about being seen to be not good enough or a failure when, having to present something or do something in a different way. So the way to sort of step back then is that to try and think about the situation then differently. Well, they might not be so concerned. Other people in this team, can make mistakes and people don't laugh at them. People don't pull them up on it. We support each other. So why wouldn't they support me? It doesn't mean failure just because I've made a mistake. So starting to challenge the initial sort of thinking that might be there that's causing a lot of the anxiety, and stepping back and saying, okay, what else? What evidence is there that it's not going to be so bad? And this is also a really good tip if you are thinking about, and noticing how you're talking to yourself and being quite critical or hard on yourself, is to ask yourself, if this was somebody else, if this was somebody else's situation right now, what advice would I give them? How would I talk to them? What would I say to them? And it's so key because nearly everybody I work with says, well, I wouldn't say it like this. Even the tone of voice can be so different when you're giving advice to a friend. You're kind, you're compassionate, you're understanding, you make allowances, and it's starting to sort of see, okay, if I'm not doing that for myself, I'm really, not being fair. So starting to write down, well, if this was somebody else, what advice would I give? And then listening to your own advice, really playing it back to yourself. That can help you feel less anxious and become more neutral. It doesn't mean you have to be positive about everything all the time. Sometimes cognitive behavioral therapy has this idea that we have to think positively, but it's not always like that. It's like understanding, accepting, okay, this is a situation, but let's not think the worst. Let's just see what happens. So you can be in a neutral space, and that's often much more helpful. So if you're not so concerned about making a mistake and talking to yourself as you would a friend, then you're more likely to carry on and try something. You can help yourself by, giving yourself more time, allowing yourself to get through that first anxiety and, letting yourself overcome some of these maybe anxiety states that might be there initially in order to then manage the task. And once we've done it once, then we start to see, okay, if I've done it once, I can do it again. And we start to move through that stuckness that we might have got ourselves into, that might be part of a habit of taking things on and then stopping and avoiding and not trying again. Okay, so tips to help increase well-being from this perspective of cognitive behavioral therapy. So there's obviously loads of things that we can talk about in terms of well-being. And if we're thinking about maybe using this for people who are in sort of the middle sort of ages, going through menopause, that's something that I've been experiencing recently. So it might be quite, useful to sort of align it with this, is thinking. Let's look at the thinking first in terms of well-being. So often when we are struggling, we are noticing that we're becoming more anxious. And a lot of the time when we're worried and when we're anxious, we are thinking the worst. We are catastrophically thinking about the worst possible outcome. And we become more anxious and fearful of that and almost planning for that worst case scenario, forgetting that it's just one option. And in order to help ourselves, it's stepping back from that and sort of saying, okay, what else might happen? What's the best that can happen in this situation? And that can help switch things around. When we're going through changes in our well-being, when there are health issues around, when there are, say, perimenopause, physical sensations going around and changes to how we see ourselves, we can often feel that we are more critical and we're not as kind as we could be. So it's capturing not only the way we talk to ourselves, like, oh God, you're so stupid, not only just they are so stupid, but also that tone of voice. So trying to let go of that critical element and actually turning that into something else. So looking at how you might write down things that you notice you do well each day. That's often a task I ask people to do, because it can really then turn you into seeing, yes, I might not do everything well. And yes, oh, I got that wrong today, but I've also done these things I'm really pleased about. Trying to let go of assumptions of others. So again, when we're holding critical thoughts about ourselves, we can also assume that other people are thinking the same way as ourselves. And that, how do we know that? We don't know that. We are almost putting onto other people our own negative view of ourselves. And of course, that's not very fair, is it? We don't know that. And it's much more helpful to sort of assume that we don't know what people are thinking rather than we think they're thinking the worst. And that reminder then that thoughts are not facts. If you take away two things from today's session regarding thinking, the thoughts are just one way that we can talk to ourselves about something. It doesn't mean it's true. And the other thinking change is treat ourselves as we would a friend. So start talking to ourselves as we would if this was a friend in that situation. Now, physically, there's lots to do with our physical bodies that we can help ourselves with. So there's healthy eating, there's drinking water, the sleep patterns, being able to sort of really see and maybe monitor for a while what's going on physically and what physical actions am I taking that are helpful or unhelpful. What I say to people in the first instance with anxiety particularly, and when we're going through menopause, often anxiety states are quite common, is to utilize calming techniques. So the calming breath is one of the things that's quite key. So breathing out for longer than you breathe in, using an app like Calm, Headspace, they're really helpful. They do lots of small apps to help you with that breathing. There's lots online, lots on YouTube that you can look at, which can really help as well. Slowing actions down, so not rushing, giving yourself a bit more time in between actions. And once you finish something, take note, I've done that. Just a pause after you finish one action before you rush into the next thing can really help physically us contain and manage our response so we don't go into that fight or flight so quickly. Practice your relaxation techniques, and yoga, particularly for women, is so helpful because it uses the body, the breathing, it connects the mind also into the body so well. And it's such a helpful approach. I fully endorse it. And finally, because if we're looking at CBT, so the behavioral changes, is trying to understand and look at the patterns of when you might be avoiding things, when you're getting anxious or overwhelmed, to not avoid altogether, but how can you break things down? How can you set the goals that become so easy and manageable that I can do that little bit today? And it helps us feel better in ourselves. It helps us give ourselves a boost, a little bit of motivation, and we usually can then put that into the next day. When you're doing small tasks, when you're setting yourself goals, try and put in something that you can connect to each day. How am I going to do that tomorrow? What's my little part of that task that I want to do tomorrow or the next day? So monitoring that and putting that into place can really help us feel like we're fulfilling, feeling motivated, we've got a purpose to stick to. Focus more on what's going around you, again, because when we are concerned about what's going on in terms of our health and our well-being, sometimes we get over focused on how we're feeling inside, and that actually can increase our attention and awareness and increase the sensations. So when we're focusing that way, we feel more pain, we feel more anxiety, we feel more stress. So try to use mindfulness in this approach then to be focused more around you. I say to people, just when you're on a walk or when you're doing any day activities, just be in the five senses just for a few minutes, and that can help shift everything, which is really helpful. So again, that's a really good tip that I use with everybody. And just for alcohol, caffeine use, they are common triggers for anxiety and depression. So just be aware that sometimes when we're going through changes, we go to something that when we're tired, just have another coffee or another tea, or just have that alcohol. It just helps me sleep. But they are some of the maintaining factors. And it's one of the things, again, I monitor with people quite soon, into treatment, because that's often one of the causes of increased symptoms. So there's just some of the very basic, but hopefully they are very helpful, all of those things I put on the list here, that I use with people very commonly. So it's not rocket science, but sometimes we just need to check back in with ourselves and what helps us, what are we not doing that we could be doing, and taking time to put those into our day or our week to help ourselves. Okay, so I'm doing more webinars. You can check me out on my email and website if you want to know more about anything that's coming up for me soon. But Amita, are there any questions? Has anyone come up with anything?
Yeah, I think one of the questions is that what is the difference between hypnotherapy and CBT? Can you and also, like, when people go for counseling, right? They just say, oh, why don't you go talk to a counselor? So
Yes.
what is that? How's that different with CBT and counseling?
Yes. Okay. So with counselling, it's an approach where there's active listening and an awareness of difficulties that somebody might be having. And the focus is more on understanding the emotional well-being of somebody and linking that to how they might have experienced things in the past. So childhood experiences or any relationship aspects. And although CBT does look at past experiences, it's linking it much more into, well, how is this affecting this current situation that you're in? Whereas counselling can look at the past and really work through past issues in that sort of space, much more a sharing and a talking. It's not so much an action-based, okay, so what are you going to do differently? How are you going to put that into an action plan? How are we going to take that forward? Which is where CBT has a different approach to sort of different situations. So both have there is overlap, but they have different styles in order to sort of help somebody in a slightly different way. So if someone's struggling with, really having difficulty getting in touch with their emotions, feel very blunted, numb, they struggle in relationships, cannot communicate very easily, and a counselling approach might be really helpful to unpack that, and where's that come from, and how do I understand that within myself, and how has my childhood experiences led to me having difficulty committing in relationships. So counselling would have that much more than CBT. Hypnotherapy, I'm not a hypnotherapist, so I can't explain the difference, particularly from a hypnotherapy point of view, but it's going into just under the consciousness of the way of thinking and how that, patterns of thinking that somebody might have, and it's touching into almost an unconscious level to help somebody sort of maybe do things in a different way. That's my understanding of it. Whereas CBT is very much in the consciousness of what are you noticing in your thoughts? Where do you sort of understand that from? So it's not going into a sort of, you're not sort of, in hypnotherapy, you're not asleep, you are conscious, but it's looking at that almost the unconscious sort of way of thinking about things. I hope that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also mentioned about the free resource. Do you mind sharing that? That you mentioned that there's a free resource or a self-help that people can take.
Yes. So there's two main resources I give out to people, just because they're all free and there's loads of good information on them. So one's Australian based. It's the Centre for Clinical Interventions. That's if you type that into Google, it will come up.
Centre for Clinical Interventions. Okay.
And on that there's hundreds of different modules on different sorts of problems and modules that people can work through in a self-help sort of way. Okay. And the other one is Get Self-Help. It's called Get Self-Help. And there's worksheets, which I give to people, and also leaflets. Yeah. Okay.
Well, no, I think this is great. This was just, I have read so much research that CBT can be very effective in a lot of different conditions that you talked about. And of course, Nourish Talk is focused on more on the women, wellness, particularly on perimenopause, menopause, and beyond. So I was always very intrigued that how do we introduce this topic to our viewers and to our listeners, that how can CBT be more of not only for perimenopause, as you said, but an umbrella of so many different chronic conditions that are out there that people are suffering from, that they should at least try the CBT out, right?
Yes. Get a little bit more information, look online, because there's lots of stuff out there. So just be curious, because it is so helpful. It does work. If you put the work in, it does work. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Carrie. I really appreciate your time and dedication and passion for this profession. And I really appreciate that. And that's what we are trying to bring, experts like yourself, who can introduce different type of holistic therapies that are effective, not only for perimenopause, menopause, but other chronic conditions as well.
Thank you, Amita. Thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. And bye-bye.
Bye-bye.